Hello, economics students. Today we're going to talk about America's government and the role of the American government in our economic system. The goal of our government's activities within our economic system is to foster economic growth and stability, and today we're going to look at that in detail. Now remember, the United States is a free enterprise system predominantly, but because the American government does get involved in our economy, technically we are a mixed economy, just like every other economy in the world today is a mixed economy. But within the American system, even though we're a mixed economy, we lean very heavily towards free enterprise. But the fact that the government is involved in our economy does make us theoretically a mixed economic system. So even though the role of our government is fairly limited in the economy, it is playing a role, and let's take a look at the different ways in which the American government gets involved in our economy. Now, the first way is to track and forecast the economy. The government wants to make sure that we can tell how the economy is doing. And the way the government does that is through measuring and tracking the GDP, gross domestic product. The gross domestic product is the total value of all the goods and services that our economy produces. And we're going to look at that in more detail as the semester progresses, including tomorrow we'll spend largely looking at GDP. But suffice it to say for this presentation that the GDP has been growing, and you can see the trend on the GDP going all the way back into the middle of the last century. And occasionally the GDP shrinks. When you see those shaded areas on this graph, that means that we are in a recession. And when you have a recession, the economy actually produces less goods and services than it did before. That's the definition of a recession. But in the last 2 years, the economy has really been growing very, very rapidly since the COVID recession came to end back in 2020. So that's the first way the government gets involved, through tracking and forecasting the economy through measurement of the GDP. The government also wants to encourage economic strength, and the way they do that is to try to ensure that our economy and the workforce is fully employed. We want to make sure we're utilizing all of our labor resources in the best and most efficient way possible. In this particular graph, you see the unemployment in the United States going back into the middle of the 20th century. When that line graph is low, near the bottom of the graph, that's a good thing. When you see a big peak, that's a bad thing. A peak means high unemployment. When it's low, that's low unemployment. And look at what happened in the last few years. Look at how the unemployment rate skyrocketed during the COVID recession, but that was a very short-lived recession, and since then unemployment rate has really plummeted to a very, very low level. So encouraging economic strength through full employment. We also want to encourage more than just economic strength. We want to encourage economic growth, and we do that through government tax policies and spending policies. Again, in order to understand whether or not we should perhaps be taxing more or spending more within our government, we need to know where we stand economically, and we do that again by measuring GDP and unemployment. Excuse me. Okay, we also want to measure economic or achieve economic stability. And what we mean by economic stability is we want to control inflation. Inflation is where prices increase. We're in an inflationary cycle right now in the United States as I'm recording this message in the summer of 2022. Inflation is bad typically when it gets over about 5%. Under 5% is not so bad. In fact, most economists want there to be roughly 2% inflation. But right now, in the summer of 2022, we're up at about 8.5% inflation, and that is considered pretty bad. And you can kind of see in this cartoon how inflation impacts the economy. When the economy has low inflation, the economy is pretty robust and big. But as inflation grows, it tends to make the economy get weaker and weaker once you get over 5%. So it's important right now that our government do whatever it can to try to get that inflation lower than where it stands this summer in 2022. Now, we're at 8.5% inflation as I'm recording this. There have been places where you have what is called hyperinflation. The United States has never had hyperinflation, but for example, in Germany during the period between the two world wars, it was the period called the Weimar Republic. They experienced incredible hyperinflation, and here you can see what I mean by that. Something that cost, say, here in January of 1923, maybe cost 5,000 German marks. By the end of that year, what had cost 5,000 German marks was now costing approximately 1 trillion German marks. That's hyperinflation. And when you have that kind of inflation, you can't live your life in any kind of successful way. And that's where you have then, in that period of time, extremist elements come to power in Germany. That was a struggle between whether or not the Nazis or the communists would take over. People start looking towards extreme systems when they're confronting something like a hyperinflationary cycle like that. Here's the inflation in the United States, again, going back into the middle of the 20th century. And you can see here that something that cost about $100 in, I believe this graph starts in 1958, would now cost in the neighborhood of $1,000. So things today are about 10 times as expensive as they were a little over 60 years ago. Again, you can see from this graph that the rate of increase in inflation has gone up since that COVID recession came to an end. You can see it right over here. That's a pretty steep line that represents fairly high inflation. So that's inflation. Another way we want to encourage economic strength is through economic security. Now, what are we talking about with economic security? Well, we want to ensure that our financial markets are healthy. When you put money in a bank, you want to make sure that that money is safe. So the government gets involved in regulating banks and stock markets to protect consumers from fraud and from bank failures. That's a very, very important element of our government. We have something called the Securities and Exchange Commission, which is part of the executive branch of our government that, again, it ensures that banks stay solvent and that the markets are fair, that the stock market is not rigged to just benefit certain elements of our society. That wasn't always the case in America. We did have periods of time in the past when the government did not get involved very much in our financial markets, and that's when you would have things like what is portrayed here in this picture, a run on the bank, where you would have rumors that a bank was running out of money and people would rush to get the money out of the bank. And when they would do that, it would become a self-fulfilling prophecy that once people started getting all their money out of the bank would in fact go out of business. It would go bankrupt. And now that we don't do that, we have ways to protect our deposits that we put into the bank so that those deposits are safe. And the government is behind ensuring those deposits to make sure that a run on the bank won't happen. And even if a bank were to go bankrupt and go out of business, your money that you had deposited in that bank is safe up to a certain deposit amount. Another way we protect economic security is to prevent against poverty as much as possible. And how do we do that? One of the most important ways we do that is through the Social Security system. I had a roommate, or not a roommate, but a neighbor in a neighboring room in the dormitory when I was in college, whose father was the sole breadwinner of the family, and his father tragically passed away when this fellow that lived in the dorm next to me was a teenager. And the mother hadn't really worked. She didn't have a lot of great skills that would have produced a high income. Well, guess what? They weren't going to starve. The Social Security kicked in and provided an income for this family to ensure that they were able to pay bills and not lose their house. And in fact, the Social Security helped to ensure that their teenage son was able to go to college. Likewise with retirees. When you retire, or when your grandparents or great-grandparents retire, they're not going to be making an income anymore, so we want to make sure that they don't, starve in their retirement. So Social Security will kick in and provide them a level of income to ensure that they are able to live their senior years in a secure way. We also want to encourage economic citizenship. People need to feel like they're involved in the economy and have a say in how the government is going to respond to economic conditions, and we do that basically through the vote. Do you want to vote Republican? Do you want to vote Democratic? The two different political parties in America do have a different way typically of viewing how the government's role in the economy should progress. So you have a say in that when you go and vote. And if you vote for a party based on what you anticipate their economic policies will be, and if that party doesn't fulfill what you had expected, then you have every right to vote that party out of office in the next election. So economic citizenship is an important part of our economic system, the government's role in it, to ensure that we have continued economic strength and confidence in our economic system. Okay, the last thing I want to touch upon is public goods and externalities. A public good is something that is provided by the government. So the public sector is that sector of our economy that involves government transactions. So, what are some examples of government transactions? I'll give you an example. If you've ever gone to the post office and bought stamps, that's a government transaction. The government owns the post office, okay? But there's other examples. So the reason that the government would even get involved in the economy in the first place is because they'll get involved in areas where there's little incentive for private businesses to provide that service or good, okay? So thinking about the post office, we want to make sure that any American, regardless of where they live, is able to utilize postal services in an affordable way. So a stamp is going to cost the same whether you live in the heart of Manhattan in New York City or if you live in the most remote part of Alaska. Stamps are going to cost the same. There would be little incentive for a private business to offer postage service to a remote part of Alaska. You just wouldn't be able to make money doing it. But the United States government does provide that. We feel that every American should have access to affordable postal services. Another reason the government gets involved is that once the service is provided, everyone in society benefits. So here's a couple of examples of government involvement in the economy. The government provides national defense, as portrayed on the left side of the screen. It wouldn't make sense for national defense to be open to private industry. You know, I might choose not to buy defense. My neighbor's going to buy defense. Well, that wouldn't make sense. We want everyone to be able to benefit in America from a strong national defense, so the government provides that service. On the right-hand side, you see a couple of whooping cranes. Whooping cranes are one of the most endangered species on Earth. At one time, I believe, there were only 16 whooping cranes left in all of the world. It's the largest bird found in the Western Hemisphere. Today there's a couple of thousand whooping cranes. The government got involved to ensure the survivability of this, majestic species that was on the verge of extinction. We believe there is a social benefit to prevent the extinction of an animal like that. The government gets involved in ensuring that happens. The next thing is related to the public goods, and that's monitoring externalities. An externality is an economic side effect that generates benefits or costs to someone other than the producer or the consumer of the good. In this picture here, you see a beekeeper. Okay, now, also in the background of this picture is a farmer's field. The farmer is actually benefiting from the presence of that beekeeper because that woman's bees will pollinate the crop of the farmer. He benefits from that. He's not paying perhaps for the honey. He may not buy the honey, but he still benefits from the production of the honey. He's getting a positive externality, a benefit, even though he isn't a consumer or producer of the product. There's also negative externalities. Here you have a picture of a strip mine, a strip coal mine. And over here there's a house. This person has a negative externality. Once upon a time, this was a very beautiful mountainous valley. Now it's got a big, ugly strip mine there. That lowers this person's property value almost certainly. No one wants to live next to a strip mine. That's a negative externality. So we want to, as a society, limit the amount of negative externalities that exist in our economy. So the government gets involved with things like pollution controls and that sort of thing. That would be a way to reduce those negative externalities. And with that, I'm going to shut off this presentation. Check Canvas and see if there's anything there for you to do. Have a great day.